It was supposed to be a quiet evening for Jason Statham. After a long, exhausting day on set, he wanted nothing more than a simple meal to unwind. He pulled into a McDonald's parking lot, seeking solace in the predictable comfort of fast food. The bright neon lights of the restaurant contrasted sharply with the dark night sky, but Jason barely noticed as he walked inside. He wasn't in the mood for conversation or fan interactions, just a quick meal and some peace. The air smelled of fries and burgers, and the sound of chatter filled the room. Jason scanned the menu, deciding on a burger and coffee, something warm and uncomplicated. Little did he know, this ordinary trip to McDonald's would change his life forever. As Jason sat at a corner table, savoring the first bite of his meal, something caught his eye. Near the trash bins, two little girls hovered, their movements hesitant yet desperate. They were twins, no older than 9 or 10, wearing mismatched clothes that looked far too big for their small frames. Their hair was unkempt, and their faces, pale under the harsh fluorescent lights, were etched with a mixture of hunger and fear. Jason noticed one of them glancing around nervously while the other dug into a trash can, pulling out half-eaten food. It was a heartbreaking sight, and Jason's appetite disappeared instantly. For a moment, he simply observed, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. How could children be in such a state, scavenging for food in a public place? The thought hit him hard. These girls were not just hungry, they were completely abandoned by the world around them. Jason glanced at the other customers in the restaurant. To his surprise and dismay, no one seemed to care. Families chatted over their meals, teenagers scrolled through their phones, and employees worked mechanically behind the counter. It was as if the twins were invisible. Jason's heart sank as he realized the depth of indifference surrounding him. The girl's desperation was palpable. One of them found a half-eaten sandwich and handed it to her sister, who took a small bite before carefully wrapping the rest in a napkin. Jason could tell they were trying to make the food last, rationing every morsel. The sight tugged at something deep within him. He had played many tough characters in movies, heroes who could fight 10 men at once without breaking a sweat. But this real-life scene left him feeling powerless. What was he supposed to do? Should he get involved? His mind raced with questions, but his heart told him there was only one answer. He couldn't just sit there and do nothing. Jason stood up, his meal forgotten. He approached the counter and ordered a large meal, burgers, fries, drinks, and even a couple of desserts. As he waited for the order, he kept an eye on the twins. One of them noticed him watching and quickly turned away, her eyes filled with suspicion. It was a look Jason didn't expect from a child. It wasn't the shyness or playfulness he usually saw in kids. This was fear, a learned wariness that spoke of a harsh life. It broke his heart even more. When the food was ready, Jason walked over to the twins. He crouched down to their level, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Hi there," he said softly, offering them the bag of food. The girls froze, their wide eyes darting between him and the bag. They didn't reach out or say thank you. Instead, they looked at him like he might take it away or expect something in return. Jason realized they were not used to kindness. They probably didn't trust anyone. "It's okay," Jason said gently. "This is for you. You don't have to do anything. Just eat." He placed the bag on the table nearest to them and stepped back, giving them space. Slowly, cautiously, one of the girls moved forward and grabbed the bag. She opened it and peeked inside, her face lighting up for the first time. The other girl joined her, and together they began eating. Jason watched from a distance, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. He was glad they had food, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the twins ate, Jason noticed other patrons giving him curious looks. Some seemed to recognize him, whispering to one another, but no one said a word about the girls. Their indifference made Jason angry. How could people ignore such a heartbreaking situation? He didn't care about being noticed as a celebrity. He cared about those girls. It was clear they needed more than just a meal. They needed help. Jason approached the twins again, this time sitting at the table across from them. "Where are your parents?" he asked softly. The girls froze again, their eyes dropping to the floor. One of them mumbled something Jason couldn't hear. He leaned in closer. "It's okay. You can tell me. Are you here alone?" The older-looking twin finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "We live close by," she said, not meeting his eyes. With our sister. Your sister? Jason pressed gently. Is she here? The girl shook her head. She's at home. She told us to find food. Jason's concern deepened. What kind of home would send two young girls out to scavenge for food in the trash? He decided he needed to find out, but he also knew he couldn't push too hard. The girls were already on edge. Do you want me to walk you home? He asked. The younger twin looked up at him, her eyes wide with hesitation. Why? She asked simply, her voice trembling. Jason smiled softly. Because I want to make sure you're safe. After a long pause, the older twin nodded. Jason felt a wave of relief, but also a growing sense of responsibility. He had no idea what he was walking into, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. These girls needed someone to care, and at that moment, he decided it would be him. As they left the McDonald's together, the night air felt colder than before. The girls walked ahead, leading the way, while Jason followed closely behind. His mind raced with possibilities. Who was their sister? Why were they living like this? And most importantly, how could he help? Little did Jason know, this small act of kindness was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything. He believed about compassion, responsibility, and the courage it takes to make a difference. As Jason followed the twins out of McDonald's, his thoughts lingered on what he had just witnessed inside. The image of the girls scavenging for food was burned into his mind. But what disturbed him even more was the indifference of the people around them. How could an entire room full of adults, families, and employees pretend not to see two hungry children? It wasn't as if the girls were hiding. They were right there, visibly struggling. Yet everyone acted as though they were invisible. Jason had seen a lot of harsh realities in his life, both on screen and off, but this particular display of apathy struck a nerve. The night was quiet as they walked along the sidewalk, the twins leading the way with hesitant steps. Jason noticed how close they stayed to each other, almost as if they were shielding themselves from the world. They didn't talk much, only whispering to one another occasionally, their voices too low for him to hear. Jason didn't push them to speak. He knew they were still wary of him, despite the food he'd given them. He couldn't blame them. Trust wasn't something you gave freely when life had taught you to expect the worst. As they walked, Jason's mind replayed the moments inside McDonald's. He thought about the families sitting at their tables, laughing and eating, completely oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignoring, the plight of those two girls. He thought about the staff, who must have seen the girls by the trash bins, but chose not to intervene. Was it fear, indifference, or just a belief that helping wasn't their responsibility? Jason felt a surge of frustration. He wasn't perfect, but he couldn't understand how people could turn a blind eye to something so obviously wrong. The twins suddenly stopped in front of a dimly lit alleyway, snapping Jason out of his thoughts. It's this way, the older girl said quietly, pointing down the narrow path. Jason hesitated for a moment, glancing at the shadows that seemed to swallow the alley. It didn't look safe, but he nodded and gestured for them to lead on. I'm right behind you, he said reassuringly. As they walked through the alley, Jason noticed how run down everything was. Trash littered the ground, and the faint smell of decay hung in the air. The walls were covered in graffiti, and broken streetlights flickered weakly overhead. This wasn't a place for anyone to live, let alone children. Jason's heart grew heavier with every step. At the end of the alley, the twins stopped again, this time in front of a battered old camper. The vehicle looked like it hadn't been driven in years. Its windows were cracked, and the paint was peeling off in chunks. A faint light glowed from inside, barely illuminating the interior. The older twin knocked softly on the door, and a moment later, it creaked open. A woman appeared in the doorway. She looked tired and worn, her hair disheveled and her face lined with stress. Her eyes darted to Jason immediately, narrowing with suspicion. "Who's this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. The older twin stepped forward, clutching the bag of food Jason had given them. "He gave us food," she said simply. "He wanted to make sure we got home okay." The woman's eyes flicked back to Jason, still full of distrust. "Why?" she asked, crossing her arms over her chest. Jason held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I just wanted to help," he said honestly. "I saw the girls at McDonald's, and I couldn't just ignore them. That's all." The woman stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she stepped aside, allowing the girls to enter the camper. She didn't invite Jason in, but she didn't close the door on him either. Taking this as a small victory, Jason stayed where he was, not wanting to push his luck. "Are you their mother?" he asked carefully, breaking the silence. The woman shook her head. "No," she said, her tone curt. "I'm their sister." Laura Jason nodded, trying to piece things together. "It's not safe for them to be out like that," he said gently. "They shouldn't have to look for food in the trash." Laura's face hardened. "You think I don't know that?" she snapped. "Do you think I like sending them out there? I don't have a choice." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, Jason saw the cracks in her tough exterior. She wasn't just angry, she was scared and overwhelmed. "I'm not here to judge," Jason said softly. "I just want to understand. Maybe I can help." Laura let out a bitter laugh. "Help? Unless you can make rent, pay off the debt collectors, and keep social services off our backs, I don't see how you can help." Jason was taken aback by her bluntness, but he didn't back down. "Maybe I can," he said firmly, "but first I need to know what's going on. What happened to your family?" For a moment, Laura said nothing, her eyes searching Jason's face for any sign of deceit. Finally, she sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "It's a long story," she muttered. Jason nodded. "I've got time," he said, pulling a small stool over to sit. He wasn't going anywhere until he understood how to help these girls and their sister. As Laura began to speak, her voice was laced with both anger and sadness. She talked about how life had been normal once. They had lived in New York, their parents working hard to provide for them. But everything changed after the financial crash. Their father lost his job, their mother fell ill, and debts began piling up. Eventually, they lost their home and ended up on the streets. Laura, the oldest, took on the responsibility of caring for her younger siblings when their parents could no longer cope. Jason listened intently, his heart breaking with every word. It wasn't just the story of one family, it was the story of so many others who had fallen through the cracks of society. By the time Laura finished, Jason felt a deep sense of responsibility. He couldn't change their past, but maybe, just maybe, he could help change their future. "I can't promise to fix everything," Jason said finally, his voice steady, "but I'll do whatever I can to help you and your sisters." Laura looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and skepticism. "Why would you do that?" she asked quietly. Jason met her gaze, his voice unwavering. "Because someone needs to, and right now, that someone is me." Inside the dimly lit camper, Jason's heart sank further as he observed the surroundings. The space was cramped and cold, with makeshift bedding spread out on the floor and piles of clothes stacked in one corner. A small heater hummed weakly, barely providing warmth against the chill in the air. The twins sat huddled together on one of the blankets, quietly finishing the food Jason had bought for them. They ate slowly, as if afraid it might be their last meal. Laura leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, her guarded expression never wavering. It was clear she didn't trust him yet, but Jason wasn't here to win her approval. He was here for those girls. Jason's gaze returned to the twins. He couldn't ignore how fragile they looked, their thin frames and tired eyes speaking of a life filled with hardship. Despite their young age, there was a certain weariness in their demeanor, a heaviness no child should have to bear. The older twin, who had introduced herself as Lily, kept glancing at Jason with a mix of curiosity and caution. Her younger sister, Ava, clung to her arm, her wide eyes darting around the room nervously. It was as though they expected something bad to happen at any moment. "Do you go to school?" Jason asked softly, breaking the silence. Lily shook her head, her voice barely audible when she replied, "We used to, but not anymore." Jason frowned. "Why not?" Laura answered for her. "Because we can't," she said sharply. "No address, no stability. The system doesn't care about kids like them." Her tone was bitter, but Jason could hear the underlying pain. "But they're smart," Laura added after a moment, her voice softening. "Lily helps Ava learn at home. Or, well, as much as we can manage." Jason nodded, processing the information. He glanced at the girls again. "Do you always go out looking for food?" Lily hesitated, her eyes flickering to Laura, who nodded slightly. Taking this as permission, Lily whispered, "Sometimes, when there's nothing here." Jason clenched his fists, struggling to contain his frustration. The thought of these young girls rummaging through trash bins for food was almost too much to bear. He couldn't understand how they had been left to fend for themselves like this. Where was the community? Where were the systems meant to protect vulnerable children? "What about your parents?" Jason asked gently. Lily and Ava exchanged a look, and Ava's eyes filled with tears. Laura sighed deeply and sank onto a worn-out chair. "They're gone," she said flatly. "Dad left years ago. Mom, she passed away a few months ago." Jason's chest tightened. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and he meant it. Laura shrugged, trying to appear indifferent, but her voice cracked when she spoke. "It's just us now. Always has been, really." She looked at the twins with a mixture of love and guilt. "I try to take care of them, but it's not easy. Not when you're constantly looking over your shoulder." "Looking over your shoulder?" Jason repeated, his brows furrowing. Laura hesitated, then sighed. "Debt collectors. We owed a lot of money before everything fell apart. Now those scumbags think they can take whatever they want. They don't care that we have nothing left." Jason's jaw tightened, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "They've been threatening you?" Laura nodded grimly. "They come around every few weeks, demanding payment. When I can't give them anything, they take what little we have. Food, clothes, whatever they can grab. I've tried hiding from them, but they always find us." Jason's fists clenched. He had seen plenty of injustice in his life, but hearing about people exploiting a struggling family like this made his blood boil. He looked at Laura, his voice firm. "They won't bother you again. I'll make sure of it." Laura's eyes narrowed. "And how do you plan to do that? You don't even know us." Jason met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "I don't need to know you to know this isn't right. No one should have to live like this, especially not these girls. I can help you, but you have to let me." Laura stared at him for a long moment, weighing her options. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained skeptical. "Fine," she said, "but don't make promises you can't keep." Jason turned his attention back to the twins. "Do you feel safe here?" he asked, his voice gentle. Lily shook her head. "Not really," she admitted. Ava clung tighter to her sister, whispering, "It's scary at night." Jason's heart ached. He couldn't imagine how terrifying it must be for them, living in constant fear of both hunger and danger. He made a silent vow to change that. These girls deserved a chance at a normal life, and he was going to do everything in his power to give it to them. As the night wore on, Jason learned more about their situation. Every detail only strengthened his resolve. The twins had been through more in their short lives than most adults could imagine. Yet despite everything, they had each other, and that bond was what kept them going. "I'll help you," Jason said finally, his voice steady with determination. "But I need you to trust me." Lily and Ava exchanged a hesitant glance, then nodded. Laura, though still guarded, seemed to relax slightly. "All right," Laura said. "But if you're serious about helping, there's something you need to know." Jason leaned forward, his attention fully on her. "What is it?" Laura's face darkened. "It's about Freya." Jason's stomach sank at the name. "Who's Freya?" "Our youngest sister," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's missing." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Jason's mind raced. Missing? How long had she been gone? Where could she be? And most importantly, what had happened to her? Laura's next words sent a chill down his spine. "She was taken." Jason felt a surge of adrenaline. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop until he found Freya and brought her home. Jason sat silently for a moment, letting the weight of Laura's words settle over him. Freya, the youngest sibling, had been taken. The thought of a child being ripped away from her family was unbearable. Jason's mind was already racing, trying to piece together a plan. "When was she taken?" Jason asked, his voice calm but urgent. Laura took a shaky breath. "A few weeks ago. It happened so fast. These men came out of nowhere. They knew we couldn't fight back." Her voice cracked as she spoke, but she quickly composed herself. I tried to stop them, but I couldn't. They said they'd come for the rest of us if I made any trouble. Jason's fist clenched tightly. Did you call the police? Laura shook her head. The police don't care about people like us. To them, we're just another group of homeless nobodies. I couldn't risk it. What if they took Lily and Ava too? Jason leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. Listen to me, he said firmly. You're not nobodies, and you don't have to face this alone anymore. We're going to get Freya back. Laura looked at him, her expression a mix of hope and fear. How? You don't even know where she is. Jason's mind was already calculating. He had dealt with dangerous people before, not just in movies, but in real life. He knew how these kinds of operations worked, how they thrived on fear and secrecy. Do you have any idea who these men are? He asked. Laura nodded reluctantly. I've heard their names whispered around here. They're part of a group that preys on families like ours. They call themselves the Collectors. They take kids and sell them. Her voice faltered, and she looked away, unable to continue. Jason felt a wave of rage surge through him. The thought of anyone profiting from the suffering of children made his blood boil. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Anger wouldn't help Freya. Focus would. Do you know where they operate? Jason pressed. Laura hesitated. There's a trailer park on the outskirts of town. That's where I think they're keeping her. But it's dangerous, Jason. Those men don't care about rules or lives. If they catch you... Jason cut her off, his voice steady. They won't. I've dealt with men like this before. Trust me. Laura stared at him, her doubt evident, but there was also a flicker of hope in her eyes. You're serious about this, aren't you? Jason nodded. Dead serious. He stood up, his mind already formulating a plan. He couldn't do this alone. If he was going to take on a group like the Collectors, he needed backup. Jason pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in a while. Robbie, he said when the call connected, I need your help. Robbie, a longtime friend and a police officer, immediately picked up on the urgency in Jason's voice. What's going on? He asked. Jason explained the situation in as much detail as he could, leaving nothing out. Robbie listened silently, and when Jason finished, his friend let out a low whistle. That's heavy, Robbie said, but you know I've got your back. Where do you need me? Jason glanced at Laura, who was watching him closely. There's a trailer park on the outskirts of town, he said into the phone. I'll text you the location. Meet me there, and bring backup if you can. Got it, Robbie replied. But Jason, be careful. These guys sound dangerous. Jason smirked, though there was no humor in it. Dangerous is my specialty. After ending the call, Jason turned back to Laura. Stay here with Lily and Ava. Lock the door and don't open it for anyone but me or Robbie. Laura hesitated, then nodded. Please, she whispered, bring her back. Jason placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I will, he promised. With that, he stepped out into the night, his resolve unshakable. The trailer park loomed in the distance, its dim lights barely visible against the darkness. Jason's heart was pounding, not with fear, but with determination. Freya was out there, scared and alone, and he wasn't going to stop until she was safe. As he approached the trailer park, Jason's senses heightened. The place was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of distant voices and the occasional bark of a dog breaking the silence. The trailers were lined up haphazardly, their windows darkened and their exteriors covered in grime. Jason scanned the area, looking for anything suspicious. He spotted movement near one of the larger trailers and crept closer, staying in the shadows. Two men stood outside, talking in low voices. Jason strained to hear their conversation, catching snippets about another shipment and keeping the kids quiet. His blood boiled. These were the men he was looking for. Jason waited for the right moment, then moved swiftly. Within seconds, he had one of the men pinned against the trailer wall, his arm twisted painfully behind his back. Where is she? Jason growled, his voice low and menacing. The man stammered, his bravado evaporating under Jason's icy glare. I don't know what you're talking about, he protested. Jason applied more pressure, making the man wince. Wrong answer. Try again. The other man tried to intervene, but Jason was faster. He disarmed him with a quick, precise move and pressed him against the wall as well. "Now," Jason said, his voice cold and deadly. "Where is Freya?" The first man broke, fear written all over his face. "She's in the main trailer," he blurted out. "But you'll never get to her. They're armed." Jason smirked, his grip tightening. "Let me worry about that." He knocked the men unconscious and moved toward the main trailer, his movements silent and deliberate. Inside, he could hear faint voices and the sound of a child crying. His heart clenched. Freya. Jason steeled himself, then burst through the door. What happened next would change everything. Jason burst into the trailer with the force of a hurricane. The door crashed against the wall, startling the men inside. There were 3 of them, each armed and visibly stunned by the sudden intrusion. Freya's small frame was huddled in a corner, her tear-streaked face turning toward the commotion. The room was dimly lit, with a grimy table covered in empty bottles and scattered cash. Jason quickly assessed the situation, his eyes darting between the men and their weapons. His heart pounded, but his focus never wavered. Freya's terrified eyes locked onto his, and he gave her a slight nod, silently promising that she would be safe. "What the hell?" one of the men growled, reaching for his gun. Jason moved like lightning. Before the man could react, Jason closed the distance between them, delivering a sharp strike to his wrist. The gun clattered to the floor, and Jason followed up with a powerful punch that sent the man sprawling. The second man lunged at Jason with a knife, but Jason sidestepped him effortlessly, grabbing his arm and twisting it until the knife dropped. With a swift kick, Jason sent him crashing into the table, knocking over bottles and scattering cash across the floor. The third man hesitated, his gun shaking in his hands as he aimed it at Jason. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice betraying his fear. Jason's icy glare froze him in place. "Put it down," Jason ordered, his tone low and menacing. For a moment, the man seemed to consider his options. Then, realizing he was outmatched, he dropped the gun and raised his hands. Jason didn't waste any time. He kicked the gun out of reach and grabbed the man by the collar. "Who's in charge here?" Jason demanded, his voice like steel. The man stammered, "It's Connie. She runs everything. Please don't hurt me." Jason shoved him aside, his focus shifting to Freya. He approached her slowly, kneeling to her level. "Freya," he said gently, his voice softening, "I'm here to take you home." Freya stared at him, her small body trembling with fear. She didn't speak, but her eyes filled with tears as she reached out for him. Jason scooped her up in his arms, holding her close. "You're safe now," he whispered. As he turned to leave, the first man began to stir, groaning as he tried to get to his feet. Jason shot him a warning glance. "Stay down," he growled. The man wisely obeyed, slumping back to the floor. Jason carried Freya out of the trailer, his senses on high alert. He knew the commotion might have drawn attention, and he needed to get her out of there quickly. As he stepped outside, he spotted Robbie's car pulling up, red and blue lights flashing. Robbie jumped out, flanked by 2 other officers. "Jason!" he called. Jason approached him, still holding Freya tightly. "I've got her," he said, relief evident in his voice. Robbie's eyes softened as he looked at the little girl. "Good job," he said, then turned to his officers. "Secure the area. Arrest anyone involved." Jason handed Freya over to a waiting paramedic, who gently wrapped a blanket around her and began checking her for injuries. Freya clung to Jason's hand, her eyes wide with trust. "You're going to be okay," Jason assured her. "They're going to take care of you now." Freya nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. Robbie approached Jason, his expression serious. "This is a big operation, Jason. These guys aren't just small-time criminals. They're part of a trafficking ring. We'll need to dig deeper." Jason's jaw tightened. "Do whatever it takes to shut them down," he said firmly. "No one else should have to go through this." Robbie nodded. "We will. And Jason, you did good tonight." Jason didn't respond, his focus still on Freya. He crouched down to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're so brave," he said softly. "Your sisters are waiting for you. Let's get you home." Freya's lips quivered, and she threw her arms around his neck, holding on as though she never wanted to let go. Jason's heart swelled with emotion. This was why he had fought so hard, to bring her back to the people who loved her. With Robbie handling the scene, Jason carried Freya to his car. The drive back to Laura's camper was quiet, the tension from earlier replaced by a sense of calm. Freya clung to him the entire way, her tiny hand clutching his shirt. When they arrived, Laura and the twins ran out to meet them, tears streaming down their faces. "Freya!" Laura cried, pulling her youngest sister into her arms. Lily and Ava joined the embrace, their sobs mingling with Freya's. Jason stood back, letting them have their moment. The sight of the reunited family filled him with a sense of accomplishment. Laura turned to Jason, her face shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to repay you." Jason shook his head. "You don't have to. Just take care of them." As the girls clung to each other, Jason felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had done what he set out to do. Freya was safe, and her family was whole again. But as he watched them, a new resolve took root in his heart. This wasn't the end. There were others out there, other children, other families, who needed help. And Jason wasn't the kind of man to walk away when he could make a difference. For now, though, he allowed himself to breathe. Freya was home, and that was enough. As the morning sun rose, its warm light illuminated the modest camper that now felt like a sanctuary. Inside, Freya sat curled up with her sisters, a faint smile breaking through her weary expression. Laura watched them closely, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and gratitude. Jason stood by the door, observing quietly, his mind replaying the events of the night. The silence was comforting, but Jason knew it wouldn't last. Robbie had been clear. The group responsible for Freya's abduction was part of a larger trafficking operation. While one victory had been secured, the battle was far from over. Laura approached Jason, her steps tentative. "You saved her," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You didn't just bring her back. You gave us hope again." Jason turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You don't owe me anything," he replied. "But if we're going to keep Freya and the others safe, we have to stay a step ahead." Laura nodded, her resolve strengthening. "What can we do? We've spent so long running, hiding. I don't even know how to fight back." Jason crossed his arms, his voice firm but reassuring. "You start by standing your ground. You're stronger than you think, Laura, and you're not alone anymore." Laura's eyes welled up with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "What about those men? The ones who took Freya? They won't stop, will they?" Jason shook his head. "No, they won't. Not unless we make sure they can't." He glanced out the window, his gaze distant. The image of Freya huddled in the corner of that trailer was still fresh in his mind. It wasn't just about this one family anymore. It was about all the others who might be suffering in silence. Robbie arrived a short while later, looking exhausted but determined. He carried a file in his hand, his expression grim. "Jason," he said, nodding in greeting, "we've arrested a few of the men from the trailer park, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. These guys are connected to a much larger network." Jason's jaw tightened. "How big are we talking?" Robbie sighed. "Big enough that we're going to need all the help we can get. This isn't just a local problem. It's a national one. Maybe even international." Jason exchanged a glance with Laura, who looked visibly shaken. "What happens now?" she asked. "We'll keep digging," Robbie said. "But we need people willing to testify, people who can point us to the right places." He looked at Laura. "That's where you come in." Laura hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes. "Testify? You mean stand up in court? Against them?" Jason stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have to decide right now, but think about it. Your story could save others, and I'll be with you every step of the way." Laura looked at him, her fear slowly giving way to determination. "If it means keeping my sister safe, I'll do it." Robbie nodded approvingly. "That's brave of you, and it could make all the difference." Jason turned back to Robbie. "What about Freya? What happens to her and the others while this plays out?" "We'll set them up with a safe house," Robbie said. "Somewhere they can stay while we sort this out. But it's going to take time." Jason frowned, thinking. "They can stay with me for now," he said. Laura's eyes widened. "Jason, we can't impose—" "You're not imposing," Jason interrupted. "I have the space, and it's safe. Safer than staying here." Laura hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you. For everything." Jason gave her a small smile. We'll get through this. Together. That evening, Jason drove Laura and the girls to his villa. The stark contrast between their old life and this new environment was evident. The spacious rooms, the clean linens, and the sense of security were overwhelming at first. But it didn't take long for the girls to settle in. Freya, still clinging to Jason, finally began to open up. "You're like a superhero," she said quietly, her small voice filled with awe. Jason chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Not quite, kiddo. Just someone who cares." As the days passed, the family began to heal. The girls' laughter slowly returned, filling the villa with warmth. Laura found herself smiling more often, her hope renewed. Jason, however, remained focused. He spent hours on the phone with Robbie, strategizing and gathering information. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Laura looked at Jason and said, "You've done so much for us already, but why? Why go through all this for strangers?" Jason paused, his gaze thoughtful. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "If we don't look out for each other, who will?" Laura nodded, her respect for him growing. "You've changed our lives, Jason. I'll never forget that." Jason gave her a small smile. "You're stronger than you think, Laura. You'll be the one to change your own life. I'm just here to help you get started." As the weeks went by, Jason became more involved in advocacy work. With Robbie's help, he began raising awareness about trafficking and exploitation, using his platform to reach a wider audience. He spoke at events, donated to shelters, and worked tirelessly to make a difference. But his greatest accomplishment was seeing Laura and her sisters thrive. They were no longer the frightened, broken family he had first met. They were survivors, strong, determined, and filled with hope. One evening, as Jason watched the girls play in the garden, Laura joined him. "You've given us more than just a safe place," she said. "You've given us a future." Jason looked at her, his expression serious. "And you've reminded me why it's worth fighting for." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the villa, Jason knew his work was far from over. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that he had made a difference. The peaceful days at Jason's villa were a blessing for Laura and her sisters, but Jason knew the fight wasn't over. The men who had taken Freya were just a small part of a much larger, more sinister network. Robbie's investigation had uncovered connections to a trafficking ring that extended across several states, and Jason couldn't rest knowing others were still at risk. Late one evening, Jason sat with Robbie in his study, papers and maps spread across the desk. Robbie leaned back in his chair, exhaustion evident in his eyes. "We've got names, locations, and a few weak links we can pressure," he said. "But taking this operation down won't be easy. These guys are well connected and dangerous." Jason studied the map, his jaw tightening. "We start with their weak points," he said. "Cut off their resources and take away their leverage. Once they're vulnerable, we strike." Robbie nodded. "We'll need witnesses, people willing to testify. Laura's story could be crucial." Jason glanced toward the room where Laura and the girls were sleeping. He hated the idea of putting them at risk again, but he also knew how strong Laura had become. She was ready. The next morning, Jason explained the situation to Laura. She listened carefully, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "If my testimony can help bring them down, I'll do it," she said firmly. "They've taken so much from us. It's time to fight back." Over the next few weeks, Jason and Robbie worked tirelessly to build their case. With Laura's testimony and information gathered from other survivors, they began to piece together the inner workings of the trafficking ring. The operation was larger than they had anticipated, with multiple layers of enforcers, recruiters, and handlers. One name kept coming up: Connie. She wasn't just a local figure. She was one of the key players in the network. Taking her down would deal a significant blow to the operation. Jason insisted on being part of the takedown. "You'll need someone who can think on their feet," he told Robbie. "Someone who isn't bound by protocol." Robbie reluctantly agreed. "Fine, but you follow my lead. We're doing this by the book." The operation was set for a cold, rainy night. Robbie's team moved in silently, surrounding the dilapidated warehouse where Connie was rumored to be hiding. Jason, dressed in dark clothing, stayed close to Robbie, his sharp eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Connie's enforcers scrambled to protect their boss, but they were no match for the coordinated strike. Jason moved with precision, disarming one man and incapacitating another with swift, calculated blows. When they finally reached Connie's office, she was cornered but defiant. "You think this will stop us?" she sneered. "There's always someone else to take my place." Jason stepped forward, his voice cold and steady. "Not if we burn your operation to the ground." Connie's smug expression faltered as Robbie presented the evidence they had gathered: documents, recorded testimonies, and proof of her involvement in the trafficking ring. "You're done," Robbie said. "It's over." Connie was arrested, and her capture sent shockwaves through the network. With her out of the picture, the operation began to crumble. Survivors came forward, emboldened by the arrests and the promise of justice. Back at the villa, Laura watched the news coverage of the takedown with tears in her eyes. "You did it," she said to Jason, her voice filled with emotion. "You actually did it." Jason shook his head. "We did it. You and your sisters were the reason I started this fight, and your courage helped end it." Laura smiled, her admiration for him evident. "What will you do now?" she asked. Jason looked out the window, his gaze thoughtful. "There's still work to be done. People out there need help, and I'm not about to walk away." In the weeks that followed, Jason partnered with organizations dedicated to fighting trafficking and supporting survivors. He used his resources and connections to raise awareness and provide aid. His villa became a temporary sanctuary for those in need, a place where people could heal and rebuild their lives. Laura and her sisters eventually moved into a home of their own, but they remained close to Jason. Freya, now full of energy and confidence, often visited him, calling him her real-life superhero. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Jason sat with Laura on the patio, sipping coffee and reflecting on everything they had been through. "You've given us so much more than safety," Laura said. "You've given us hope and a future." Jason smiled, a rare warmth in his expression. "You've given me something too," he said, "a reason to keep fighting." As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Jason felt a sense of peace. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Hope you liked this story. If you want part 2 of this story, let us know in comment section.